I'm here to tell you that teaching Sam to think, that was a mistake. If you're gonna teach Sam to think, you might as well do it in style. This is from Colorful. This is the iGame GeForce RTX 3060 Ti. 3060 Ti, 3070, it doesn't sound like there's a lot of difference between those. This is an exceptionally high-end 3060 Ti. We're gonna take a look. Now this is a huge card, 323 millimeters by 158 millimeters by 60 millimeters. That is a chunker of a card. If you are running a case like the Fractal Meshify C, it's probably not going to fit unless you've got really slim fans in the front of that case, or you opt not to run any fans in the front of the case. But I wouldn't recommend that. You're going to need to run with sufficient airflow in your case. Now I said this thing was over the top high end. What did I mean by that? First, in the box, gloves. You get cloth gloves. You also get a microfiber cleaning cloth because this card has a ridiculous built-in LCD display. It's awesome. It's high fidelity. It shows a lot of cool stuff. Ridiculously high end. And you can rotate it 90 degrees. You can sort of flip it up. So if you install this card in a vertical orientation, you can still flip it up and see your display through the glass side panel. Finally, an accessory that makes sense for glass side panel computers. That is a 420 by 128 pixel display. You can upload custom imagery through the USB-C connection at the back of the card. Yeah, that's a lot of fun. That's a crazy amount of fun. Out of the box, that LCD display is going to display useful information like what's the GPU currently running at, what's your CPU running at, what's your memory load, what's the voltage. You can pick from a whole bunch of different options in the software. It's pretty neat. Alright, so it's the 3060 Ti, so you know what you're getting into because, well, NVIDIA sort of dictates what that is. You're not going to get 7,000 CUDA cores or anything like that because it's a 3060 Ti. That is 4864 CUDA cores, has an overclock, it's 1815 megahertz out of the box, and ample cooling. We'll talk about the cooling solution in a second. It's got 3 8-pin power connectors. Now, I really think they should have made one of those 8-pin power connectors optional. I tried some different combinations. It seemed to want all 3 of those 8-pin power connectors, but you don't really need all 3. Again, this is kind of a strategy because a lot of power supplies have 2 8-pin connections on a single cable. Not every power supply, but a lot of power supplies that do that can't really supply the full amount of power that a card like this would need from 2 8-pin connections that are on the same physical wire going back to your PSU, your power supply. So a lot of manufacturers are just like, let's avoid the customer service headache by just making 3 connectors. And then we know that we've got at least 2 paths back to the power supply. I get it, it's a strategy. But because it's got 3 connections in a 3060 Ti, you're gonna have to take that into account when planning your system or planning your build or planning your upgrade. Do you have 3 8-pin power connections? No. Not going to recommend this GPU for you in that case. And I know what you're thinking. Wait a minute, what about Displayport to HDMI? The chipsets for that right now are basically garbage. I've got a Club 3D adapter in to review, the one that's USB-C powered. It's not going great. That's a preview for another video. Sort of hinted at with its long dimension. The heatsink on this card is utterly ridiculous. It is the most overkill heatsink that I have ever seen. I think, I tried to tell from the pictures, I don't have the 3070 version of this card, but I would suspect that the 3060 Ti and the 3070 share the same or very similar version of this cooler. So this is an overbuilt cooler. It is crazy. This thing is heavier than most of the 2070 cards that I've gotten my hands on at this point. It weighs almost as much as a 3090. It's also a triple fan cooling design, multiple heat fans, multiple heat pipes. It is exceptional. When we were doing the game testing, I barely saw it get over 65 degrees C, like 65, 68, 70-ish. So while it does have some overclocking headroom, most of the overclocking is going to be on the memory side more than the GPU die, because the 3060 Ti from like a silicon standpoint is more or less a reduced version of the 3070. And the 3070 has higher boost clocks and a little bit higher base clock. Well, it depends on the OEM model. I'm sort of oversimplifying here, but I think it's fair to say that for some reason the silicon on this card didn't quite make the cut for a higher end card. Maybe it's to do with voltage, maybe it's to do with something else. Your best bet on overclocking this card is to start with the memory, but you can get some pretty decent core overclocks. It just depends on the game and stability and some other factors. Now, Colorful also has their own software suite. That's the iGame Center, it's one of the more well-designed pieces of GPU software here. I think some of the other bigger OEMs could look at how well this is put together and maybe have a takeaway or two, because it is surprisingly well organized and it is surprisingly intuitive. I mean, for GPU overclock software, I don't usually like installing these kind of things. I usually go straight to sort of like the standard go-to software that, you know, like one or two OEMs have and they've really got it nailed down and everybody else is kind of squirrely. This is actually pretty good. So maybe give that a try, take a look at it. Well, that's enough jawboning. Let's take a look at the actual performance. Okay, first up, we got Shadow of the Tomb Raider in high with no anti-aliasing. 178 FPS in 1080 and 129 FPS at 1440p. This card is pretty much the go-to card for 1080p gaming at really high frame rates, especially if you get a high refresh rate monitor. It is competent with most AAA titles at 1440p, though you may have to adjust the settings down to like, you know, medium, medium low, medium high, something like that. It is an 8 gig card, so you do have a fair amount of VRAM relative to the GPU horsepower that you've got on hand. In Borderlands 3 on Ultra, 1080p is 109 FPS and 1440p is 80 FPS. In Far Cry 5, it's 155 FPS at 1080 and 118 FPS at 1440. Again, you know, it's comfortably over 60 FPS at 1440p, and this is without really having to do much of anything with the you know, graphics fidelity settings. So when I talk about 1440p gaming, I'm really talking about, you know, you've got an ultra wide 1440p. That's not what we're talking about for the testing. We're talking about 2560 by 1440 testing for the benchmark results. But if you want to lock in 60 FPS at 1440p and you don't mind fiddling with the settings, and you want to do, like, say, ultra wide, like 3440 by 1440 and like 60 FPS, around 60 FPS, you can do that with this card. You just might have to fiddle with the settings. If you want between 60 and 90 FPS at 1440p, this card can do it. If you wanted to do like 144 Hertz or 165 Hertz or 240 Hertz at 1080p, this card is not a bad choice. Moving on to Tom Clancy's Wildlands with 1080p, 119 FPS, 1440p, 97 FPS. Really no surprises here. Monster Hunter World, 131 FPS at 1080p and 89 FPS at 1440. Horizon Zero Dawn with favor quality. Look, we're starting to mess with the quality a little bit. Cyberpunk 2077 at 1080p is 80 FPS. 1440, it's 46 FPS. But for artificial benchmarks, we've got 3D Mark Time Spy. Overall, it's a score of 12,044 with a graphics score of 11,960. The test system is a Ryzen 5960X system, basically running at stock, with a Be Quiet 360mm closed-loop all-in-one cooler. Really a pretty pedestrian system than that. Otherwise, we've got G-Skill memory running at 3600 CL14, so it's pretty fast memory. 16 gigabytes, so that's single rank, not dual rank. Dual rank would probably help us out a little bit here with the 1080 frame rate, but you know, I figure if you're going to get this card, you're probably not going to opt for the dual rank memory configuration. You probably could use more than 16 gigs of RAM too. It's not going to make a huge difference, but maybe 1 or 2 FPS. Well, it depends on the game. 3D Mark Firestrike overall is 26,793 with a graphics score of 27,982 and a physics score of 39,018. DLSS. The DLSS implementation on this card for 1080p and 1440p is still pretty magical. Now, I think I start to see a little bit of some of the side effects of DLSS with this card, so things like post-motion artifacting, just little tiny visual fidelity things with DLSS. That said, this is a perfectly competent card, especially for 1440p at DLSS. So if you want a locked 60 FPS at 2560 by 1440 with Cyberpunk 2077, you can definitely do it with DLSS, and you can probably do it by just very slightly adjusting the graphical fidelity settings. It's not going to have to turn into like something, it's not going to have to turn into something as chunky as Roblox. It's still going to be pretty good quality, but you may have to fiddle with those graphic settings if you want to lock to 60 FPS at 1440. And Cyberpunk kind of falls apart if you wanted to do 3440 by 1440 ultra wide gaming. It's really not the best, even with DLSS, although it is playable. 45, 50 FPS, best case scenario. It's still, medium high-ish graphic settings. Not bad. I mean, it's not bad, but I think it's more the 2560 by 1440 / 1080p gaming card. So in conclusion, NVIDIA this generation really has knocked it out of the park. Availability is the fly in the ointment. The launch and availability with the global situation, demand, everything else with the economic situation, it was really super botched. The silicon is exciting. The product is really exciting. The availability is less than exciting. it is starting to get a little bit more available. This is a card that Colorful sent to me, no strings attached, to take a look at and see how the performance stacked up. The performance was right in line with what I would expect from a 3060 Ti. It's overbuilt, and the LCD screen is kind of a delightful novelty. If you want to save a few bucks, you can get other versions of this card that maybe eschew some of the novelty. Also from Colorful, check out their other offerings. But it is a well-manufactured, well-put-together card for what I can tell from my testing. A 3070 is faster. Even a lower-end 3070 is going to be, 5 to 10 FPS faster, even though this is pretty much the highest-end 3060 Ti that I've seen on the market. It's a nice 3060 Ti. It's a nice implementation. I can't say enough nice things about it. A little blingy for my taste, a little over the top, but it's built well. It's well engineered, and I can appreciate that. I like that. So if you can find it and there's not somebody scalping and you want this level of performance, you can't go wrong with this card. It's pretty good. I'm Wendell, this is Level 1. I'm signing out, and you can find me in the Level 1 forums. Hey, if you do a build with one of these, come show off in the Level 1 forums. I'd love to see it. And take care, and I'll see you later. There, now you got some options.